Okay, I think it's gone to now. So I think we'll start the event. So hello everybody and welcome to this Senate House Library event, which is called Communities of Printing and Publishing. Um, Before we go any further, can I ask you to keep your microphones muted? There will be a chance at the end of the presentations for you to ask questions. And you can also put comments and questions in the chat. But if you could wait till the end of the talks before you raise your voice, that would be really helpful. We've got three really wonderful talks for you today, and they're all related to the Senate House Library exhibition, which took place in 2025, and it was called Spineless Wonders, The Power of Print Unbound. Now, the physical exhibition was it was almost a year ago that it started. It was June last year and was up for about 6 months. And we've now transitioned that to an online version. And this is what we're sort of celebrating today. And you can see on the screen at the moment the homepage to that website. My colleague Tansy is going to be monitoring the chat and she'll pop the website link into the chat as well. So what you can do with this website is you can have a look at a video of the exhibition in situ, but also you can have a look at galleries of all the items that were displayed, the front covers anyway, and you can just choose an item and click on it. And this one was a particularly popular one during the exhibition with its unfortunate resonance for today. So you can have a look, see the front cover, and then some information about it. So what the website gives you is captions and more contextual information about all of the material that we had on display. And the exhibition really focused on a range of spineless materials, so material that didn't have a formally perfectly bound spine. So this could have been a flyer, a leaflet, a pamphlet, a broadside, or an artist's book, or a piece of ephemera. So it was a broad range of material from Senate House Library's collections, which we really wanted to celebrate this material because it's often quite hidden, because it doesn't have a spine. It's not often on a library shelf. You have to request it. And we just wanted to show the wealth of design and content and how these often match and how these tell us something about the culture of the times and the culture we live in now as well. The other way you can explore this site as well is to go by themes. So you can have a look at the different themes that we had within the exhibition and explore, for instance, the popular entertainment one, and have a look at all the items that were there as well. And finally, there's one more aspect that can help. You can explore all the items, which is the sort of the most library catalogue part of it that you might expect to see on a library catalogue. And this is where you can start to narrow it down. You can say, for instance, I want to look at 20th century and then choose a subject, perhaps. And these are some of the subjects of the material. You could choose 20th century poetry, and that brings you up this material here. So you can start to really play around with the content and the format at the same time. So you can look at book arts works. There aren't any of that. So, you can play around. So hopefully you'll explore the exhibition and enjoy looking at the material. But I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because we're going to move on to our wonderful speakers. And I think what's really great about our three speakers today is they're going to be talking about items that were in the exhibition or were linked to the exhibition. But whereas we were focusing so much on the format, they're going to go a bit deeper into some of the stories behind it. And that's like a real privilege, I think, for us to be able to dig deeper into some of the material. So all of our speakers are in some way connected to the material that they're going to be talking about today. There are full biographies of all our speakers on the Eventbrite page, so do have a look at those. They've all had very varied and interesting lives and work. I'm just going to give very brief introductions to them each now. I'll do them one at a time as we go through the session. We're going to be beginning with Esther Leslie. And Esther is a professor of political aesthetics at Birkbeck, University of London. Her many books include various studies of Walter Benjamin and recently The Rise and Fall of Imperial Chemical Industries, Synthetics, Sensism and the Environment from 2023. And also in that year and a bit earlier too, she worked with Melanie Jackson on the biopolitical economy of dairy. And a study of anti-fascist radio pioneer Ernst Schoen, written with Sam Dolbear, also appeared in 2023. So I'm going to be quiet now and hand over to Esther, who's going to start off the session for us. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you. Let me Get my slides up. So I'm going to be speaking about Charlie Lahr, or Charles Lahr, originally Karl Lahr of the Rhineland in Germany, my grandfather, who died when I was 7. And I met him in life, but more often in books, where there are these curious pen portraits of an idiosyncratic and hilarious character. So let me begin with one of those, a vivid picture of interwar London bohemia in R.M. Fox's Drifting Men, which was published by the Hogarth Press in 1930, where Fox describes a world of street orators, charming book-obsessed rent dodgers, bankrupts, agitators, anarchists, socialists, communists, wobblies, as my grandfather was, street lecturers who spoke of Wagner, street fighting and politics in rapid succession. So he calls them the vagabonds of the gawky stamp in the heart of London. Oops. So Drifting Men alludes to, some of them were sailors drifting on seas, but also through the cities, and they found places of rest, which were also rather turbulent places. And one of the places where they find rest is this bookshop in Holborn, where books litter the floor and are in all languages. Fox writes about the bookshop, changes Charlie Lahr's name to the Eugene, and says the following. This shifting collection of humanity settled in as best they could at Eugene's. Not always did things go smoothly. Twice the gas meter was burst open. Eugene sometimes missed valuable books. To compensate, he bought others, very cheap, from his lodger, and other bookshops missed them. But in general, a rough standard of loyalty was maintained. They made outsiders pay. They were experts at devising new ways of whiling away the tedium of life. One was to cut up the contents bills of newspapers and paste them together in a new order. A most successful and sensational production was a lovely paper with thick black type which read, Ramsay MacDonald assassinated. So Lahr spent much of his life as a bookseller, or rather not selling, for it was famously said he found it hard to part with books and only sold books to people he liked, and he would often lend them for a few weeks to those who were too poor to pay. He had acquired the bookshop from someone, Harold Edwards, for £25. Its name was the Progressive Bookshop, and it was at 68 Red Lion Street in London. It was his wife, Esther, who'd managed to scrape together the money. Her maiden name, Archer, became sort of the official name of the place. That was an anglicizing of her original name from Jewish origins in Poland, Archibald. So that was the name, Esther Archer, that appeared on the shop and press letterhead. And she dealt with the organization and finances of the shop. And you can find many colorful descriptions of this building, which was little more than a cubicle about 12 feet by 8 feet, its walls lined by books, paintings, and drawings from ceiling to floor. Bates goes on to say, although never capable seemingly of holding more than 6 people, it always seemed to be populated by a couple of dozen, with more chatting and lounging away in the passage outside. It filled up quickly, especially if one or other of the London characters, such as a man called the Human Notebook, was there expounding on world affairs, eating chips with one hand, pulling newspaper clippings from his pocket with the other. So it was cramped and confining, but there's a perversion of space when it comes to these kind of counter spaces. They have an expansiveness of other kinds. Kenneth Hopkins noted that the habitués of Lahr's shop were called customers only as a courtesy, for it really functioned more as a club. And it's an interesting point that many testify to the fact that all sorts of interwar writers, political types, thinkers, and activists were drawn to the shop as a kind of club, a sort of public space in a way, open to those who sort of felt the call from it, or who had heard from someone who had heard from someone. It produced an alternative literary community and a kind of shadow economy of literature. As Christopher Hillard argued, the progressive bookshop became a metropolitan hub and the linchpin of a network of readers and writers throughout Britain. And it was an entree into the circuits and institutions of literary London for people from Wales and the English provinces, and to a lesser extent from the Empire. An alternative to the more closed circles of Bloomsbury, the bookshop reached out to writers outside of London. There was Malachi Whitaker in Bradford, John Hampson in Birmingham, Gay Taylor and A.E. Coppard in Oxfordshire, H.E. Bates in Northamptonshire, James Hanley in Wales. Rhys Davies, the homosexual working class Welsh novelist, said when he left South Wales for London, he came into contact with people who had become professional writers, Bates, Hanley, Liam O'Flaherty, for the first time in the bookshop. And some appeared in Lars' literary journal, The New Coterie. Affairs were conducted between bookshop, cultural institutions, the authors and customers by the rapid postal system. And when members of this milieu visited London, they would sometimes stay at the shop. There were places to sleep upstairs and a battered old sofa for an extra overnighter. The critic Walter Allen called it a resort for rebels and eccentrics, so Trotskyist C.L.R. James was one habitué who asserted that La and the shop and its milieu were essential to the development of his intellectual formation in the 1930s and informed to the writing of his 1937 book, World Revolution. Nancy Cunard and her partner Henry Crowder lodged there in 1931 while she was researching her Negro anthology. It was one of the bookshops in London where books on black art might be obtained. Jomo Kenyatta, George Padmore, Krishna Menon, George Orwell, George Woodcock, Peter Abrahams, Beatrix Hastings all went there. Jonathan Rose described the shop in the 1930s as a mecca for down and outs and Nietzscheans, down and out Nietzscheans and scruffy poets. And David Goodway presented Charlie La as very probably the last in a long line of great London radical booksellers, which can be traced back to the late 18th century. La's stock was rare books, first editions, limited editions, and he also acquired and sold authors' manuscripts or letters to collectors. And there were some very wealthy collectors. Collecting bibliographic materials was a popular pursuit of London's wealthy, and there were a number of clubs and societies like the Double Crown Club or the Set of Old Volumes and the First Edition Club, which promoted and collated these pursuits with exhibitions and shows. And one customer of Lars was Lewis Sterling, well known to the library here, managing director of the EMI record company in London. Lars sold Sterling letters and manuscripts by upcoming authors of the 1930s. James Hanley, Rhys Davies and H.E. Bates. And in 1931, Sterling bought for £30 a manuscript by James Hanley and asked La to send a photo of Hanley with it. Hanley, incidentally, my grandmother's lover for a time, in turn asked Sterling for some gramophone records that he really wanted to buy the last time he'd been in London, but he, quote, didn't have a bloody cent. His coarse language was perhaps designed to play up to the daring working class demeanour exuded in his writings. The bookshop is described by R.M. Fox in Drifting Men as a rambunctious place of discussion and argument, a place of mingling of lives, ideas, behaviours and bodies. It was a type of thinking and disputing that he saw as forged from a very different material than that of the suburbs. He describes it thus: eager disputants crowded the shop, shouting their opinions, weaving names like flags of battle, banging book covers and raising clouds of dust. They were originals, all, sauce for the cold mutton of the suburbs. Their literary conversation was full of pungent criticism. They fought their way to literature as they scrambled their way through life. They hurled dogmatic pronouncements at one another with heated abandon. They had never learnt the modifications of conventional criticism, but they also escaped that conventional trick of saying commonplace nothings impressively. Every opinion was permitted, provided it was expressed with vigour, but all united in bitter antagonism to the dead hand of suburban respectability. It should be said, my grandfather spent 50 years living in suburban Friern Barnet, from where he would cycle into town. It was one of only two bookshops where, from 1928, D.H. Lawrence's Unexpurgated Lady Chatterley's Lover, published in Italy, was circulated prior to its legal availability in 1960. From 1929, it could be obtained there in a cheap paperback edition produced in Paris. Continental editions escaped censorship laws. I think this is where the sign, one of the signs from the exhibition, comes in. So that next to a soot-covered book, it read, "This is the only dirty book we have. Please don't waste time asking for others." To sort of, a sign as a kind of decoy or a kind of joke, so people didn't get the shop into trouble for coming in and asking if they could get other types of filthy literature like D.H. Lawrence. Charlie Lahr planned an English edition around the same time. Lawrence remarked in a letter, "I don't mind a bit if your friend does 500 of Our Lady. He can give me 50% on his selling price," that being the usual. In May 1929, he let his Italian publisher know. "A man in London talks of doing an edition of 500 there, printing it himself in London, right under Jix's nose." Jix was the name of William Joyson Hicks, the man in the Home Office, a Victorian moralist on a mission. In the 30s, Lahr had his own press, used by his publishing imprint, the Blue Moon Press. I think it once belonged to William Morris, and it was used to produce little poems and political pamphlets and literary pamphlets. Lahr worked with the typographer Herbert Jones. The idea was to continue Morris's Book Beautiful tradition, whereby the book is beautiful by force of mere typography, as Morris put it. And the print runs were small, and the volumes expensive, maybe 6 times more than the price of a hardback novel at the time. In the light of Lahr's anarchist and socialist politics, how did such practice square with this luxury production of rarefied commodities? It's been described by Hugh Osborne in his study of the bookshop as a multi-pronged effort. For one, to redistribute wealth by siphoning money from the wealthy collectors of the time to the writers. Osborne cites a letter from Liam O'Flaherty to Esther Lahr, noting that the journal they've produced is good and that it is a way to escape the public and make the bourgeoisie pay. In another sense, Osborne argues, limited and rarefied production is a strategy to secure a place in the market by denying the market. That is to say, to counter the commercial lowest common denominator of mass culture with something of worth. Presumably, as the private lending libraries, which attempted to raise the quality of books available to readers compared to those libraries run by Boots and the like, this circulation of commodities was quality material worth the price, and in any case, those who can afford it might subsidize the other activities of those who can't. There was another motive. Limited editions were a means by which writers could avoid obscenity laws. One of Lahr's most X-rated stories is by James Hanley and called The German Prisoner, with illustrations by William Roberts. The scenario: 2 British soldiers in the First World War attack, rape, and kill a handsome young soldier before all sink beneath the sea of mud which oozed over them like the restless tide of an everlasting night. There was awareness of the contradictions and difficulties of appealing to mass or elite markets. In one of Lahr's Blue Moon booklets from 1931 by Herbert E. Palmer, titled What the Public Wants, we see a writer desperately adopting different styles and media to establish a literary career and reflecting on the place of this within a commercial environment of publishing. More empirical evidence of the discussions of the issues connected to limited edition production, a way of launching unestablished writers without having the indignity of failing in the mass market, comes from a letter from H.E. Bates to A.E. Coppard in 1929, where he writes of something like a vicious principle behind it all, and the thought of one's labours reposing on collectors' shelves like mere stocks and bonds awaiting a rise in the market is utterly damnable. But he also notes the retention of copyright allows for later use of the material after its initial foray into a rarefied world. But the world is not just a rarefied one. There's a world of harshness depicted in the literature and in the lives of those who write it. Half of R.M. Fox's Drifting Men is taken up by the chapter Men in Prison, which is about the demoralizing effects of prison on criminals or those deemed criminals, including the conscientious objectors and deserters, as Fox himself was, who crammed the jails. He was jailed with hard labour 3 times for 5 years in all at Wormwood Scrubs and Brixton for refusing to serve in the British Army in the First World War. Lahr, too, knew about incarceration, interned in both World Wars, once at Alexandra Palace, from which these pictures stem, and in the Second War in the Isle of Man. And he was threatened with jail or deportation to Nazi Germany for receiving stolen goods, which A. Bates makes the subject of a very curious story. But I'll stop here as I've gone on too long. There's a lot more to say about this life, but I think somewhere here, yes, I have a couple of pictures. The bookshop moved around at different times. It was on Little Newport Street for a while, and finally ended up, I think, in the ILP, Independent Labour Party headquarters in King's Cross, which is probably why there's a picture of my granddad, very old, still cycling in central London at St Pancras there with his trusty bicycle, probably dropping off some literature to someone. So thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Esther. That was really fascinating, and what an extraordinary man. And both your grandparents, really, really wonderful. And we have papers from your grandfather's archive at Senate House Library, and for us as well, just to hear some more about him. I'd love to hear even more, actually. He's really wonderful, and I'm sure there'll be questions. You can either put questions in the chat now and we'll gather them together at the end, but at the end of all the talks there will be time to actually raise your voice and ask a question there as well.
I'm just trying to stop sharing, and I can't work it out. I don't know if you can kick me out or
how do I do that? So it should be up the very top next to the leave button, leaving the actual meeting.
Yeah, when I click it though, it doesn't give me the option to stop, but
well, we could carry on working out while Jim talks, because
someone else has taken control, so hopefully
there we
go. Brilliant. Thank you.
That's probably Tansy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we've now got Jim Cowan, who's going to be speaking. So I'll just give you some background to Jim. So Jim spent nearly 40 years focusing on political and social change in Britain, both academically and practically. The practical work of political and social change was between 1974 and 2012, when he was a community development worker with residents on housing estates, with family support, on institutional racism, and with disability communities. Jim acquired 5 social science degrees, including a PhD, and has also been honorary visiting research fellow for 10 years up until 2016 at London South Bank University. He retired in 2012 but continues to write and publish, most recently 2019's The Britain Potential. So Jim is going to tell us a story now of how a group of ordinary people, through the publication of A Street Door of Our Own, not only secured a major project in their community, but also influenced an entire local authority. So over to you, Jim.
Yes. So A Street Door of Our Own was published in 1977 by the Neighbourhood Association of the Honor Oak Estate in Lewisham, southeast London. And at that time, the estate consisted of 27 tenement-style blocks built between 1932 and 1938 on a 25-acre site. There's about 10,000 people living there. So there are over 250 estates across the UK with 10,000 or more people living on them. So this story does have wider relevance, and it's not just relevant to council estates. The local authorities were investing in community workers at that time. And me and my co-worker had been working with the active residents of the estate since 1974. And at the start, it felt to me like they saw their estate as a site of a kind of all-pervasive powerlessness affecting everybody, the results of years of empty promises and inaction. It was going downhill, people were leaving. But by 1977, just 3 years later, the estate was positively fizzing with action and activity. There was an annual play scheme, a block representatives group controlling repairs and maintenance, a parent-run youth club, a pensioners group, a mother and toddler club, and so on, all under the umbrella of a neighbourhood association. And instead of 6 or so active people running a moribund tenants association, there was, edging up to 100 active people spread across these groups, actually getting change to happen. But people were clamouring to get back on the estate by then, and it was becoming a place people wanted to live. And they'd achieved so much, but there was one thing left: getting a purpose-built youth and community centre. Now, when you work in a community in this kind of sustained way, you become aware of the shape of things. There are threads of discussion, issues that are running through the community in a sustained kind of way. So the groups and the campaigns were now all responding to most of these threads, but one still resonated away without finding a response. And it was a desire on the part of a few of the original 1930s tenants to tell their story of what the estate was like then and what it meant for today. So I started to think about a local history book as a possible piece of work, and it was the kind of thing the Neighbourhood Association would support. Now, it was easy to find people who had moved in the 30s when the estate was being built. I set up interviews with them and recorded and transcribed what they said. Lovely stories of how they came to live on the estate, their first impressions, how repairs and maintenance all worked, children playing together, the entertainment they created amongst themselves, the war years, the celebrations and the block parties after the war, and finally how they saw things now because the world had changed. So I researched the building of the estate, contrasting how well the estate worked in the past compared with its relative neglect at that time in the 70s with this more modern, in inverted commas, way of life. And I added a commentary at the back of the book on the building of the estate and many of the issues. The argument was obvious. If it took that amount of resource in the past when life was simpler and the community was more cohesive, it needs a load more resource today. And a rumour went round just before publication that the chair of the housing committee was promising the resources earmarked for the community centre on the estate to another area in the borough. And by now, the book was attracting national attention through a freelance writer for The Guardian. And this led to the equivalent of today's One Show wanting to cover the book launch, so primetime TV coverage. And by now, the leading figures on the estate were quite capable of seeing where this could go. They had soft power political capital, and they rang the chair of the housing committee and invited them to launch the book on one condition: that given the national press interest, a cast iron assurance of the council's commitment to keep the funding in place for the community centre would be given. If they didn't do this, the estate would use the press interest to give them a second story about the failure to honour the commitment to fund the community centre. And so this is what happened. The chair of housing made it clear to the national press just how much they were committing, and that it was a rock solid commitment. And at the launch, the tenants had mocked up a giant front door, as in the title of the book, A Street Door of Our Own. They mocked up this front door in paper on a big frame. And at the key moment, having primed the TV cameras and the photographers, they burst through the door dramatically, providing that all-important shot the media could use. Though the older people present, whose stories are all in the book, could not have been more moved. Finally, a 30 years dream of having this youth and community centre was happening because of their words. The estate really had got its youth and community centre. And from that point onwards, plans turned into bricks and mortar, and it was built. Their history book was what had clinched it. So launched with local and national media coverage, the book attracted great interest in the local council. The fact that such a publication could come from one of their estates meant it also commanded attention inside the housing department. Enough councillors and officers in the local authority had either read the book or were aware of its significance, so that a considerable shift of attitude towards the estate took place. And through the book, officials in all the agencies started to treat the estate and its residents with a good deal more humanity and respect. It was viewed more positively. The book got rid of years of paternalism from the local authority. No longer seen as a dumping ground or a problem estate, the book showed a vibrant and resourceful community getting on with their lives. Leading councillors moved overall council policy in the direction of mini town halls, and the committee paper proposing this acknowledged the estate book as contributing to this. It was as if the language of the people of the estate had in the end proved more enduring and insightful than that of the local authority. And just to pause for a second there, just to reflect maybe on what we can learn about all this for today. That equivalent efforts to tell a collective and living story elsewhere today have so many more media to choose from. Social media, video, the internet, TV and film. But there is also something enduring and also very human about a book, as we've been hearing. And for its relevance today, just reading it can inspire others who live anywhere where there's a story that can help move things forward. The stories of people who lived in the 30s and on through the war years to the 50s, I think are priceless. You could make a film or a TV series out of A Street Door of Our Own. And the commentary at the back does the awareness raising. It just shows how ruthless the class oppression of those days was. And the stories show a people unbowed by it, resourceful and able to enjoy life, albeit what we could consider maybe a bit of a hard life. And it shows us how community of real substance has literally been destroyed in the 21st century, in our life in many parts of the UK. So there's a need for these stories, these kinds of stories, as more and more people decide they need to take the place where they live into their own hands and find ways to get it fizzing with hope, energy, and activity. That's it.
Wonderful, Jim. That really was. And I just wanted to say that when we first got in touch with Jim, when we were researching for the exhibition, Jim emailed us some of that story, and it was such a powerful one that we really wanted him to come and share that with everybody to show, because the pamphlet itself is, you know, A5, and we were showing it that there it is. And we were showing it in an exhibition called Spineless Wonders, which has very different meanings. And what we said at the launch of the exhibition was we used this pamphlet as an example of how this kind of work is not spineless at all. It has so much power within those pages, and I'm really glad you could come today and talk about it, Jim.
Briefly, you see that?
Yeah,
that's where we worked from. We did not work from a fancy office. We
That's
worked
that
from,
one there. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
and that made all the difference.
Yeah. Oh, it's
It's a real,
wonderful.
it really is. Speaks to so much situation in today.
Well, that's
Thank you.
maybe something that we could raise when we have come to questions as well, how we
Yeah.
see things today. No, thank you. Giving us food for thought there, Jim. Thank you. And our final speaker today, I'm going to hand over to Tim. So Tim Hopkins uses the name Half Pint Press for the printing work he's been doing since 2016. He mostly prints books in unusual forms, using a tabletop letterpress in a back bedroom on Peckham Rye. In 2017, the Half Pint Press edition of the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa won the MCBA Prize for Book Art. Other Half Pint Press titles and editions include Imaginary Letters by Mary Butts. And in 2026, he'll publish a new book, The A to Z of Work by David Arnold. So the Half Pint Press edition of Imaginary Letters by Mary Butts, which was displayed in the exhibition, takes a 1926 epistolary novella and presents it as a series of 8 letters, each in its own envelope and each entirely different in form and format. So Tim is going to talk briefly about why and how he spends his time hand making books. And also he'll be starting how he starts from the text and works outwards to change and hopefully enrich the reading experience. Now I'm going to share my screen with your slides, Tim. So if someone could tell me in a moment if you can see that. Let me get rid of this one. And sorry, folks, I've just got to change screen.
Thanks.
Can you see that all? Yeah.
I can.
And I shall move to your first slide there, Tim, if
There
you
you
want
go.
to tell me when to move on.
Will do. So I make most of my books using letterpress, movable type, individual letters set. And just in case anybody thinks that a printing press is necessarily a mighty thing sitting in the basement of some giant building in a factory somewhere, that is the entirety of my printing press there, and me holding it. This sort of printing press, it's called an Adana H5 for anyone interested, would often get somewhat sneeringly referred to as hobby kit by proper printers, and I'm not one. If you could move on, Leila, then at least people don't have to look at my face. So in using that press, which is also in a flat in southeast London, although it brings with it constraints. So I can't acceptably print more than about a postcard's worth of text in any given with any given strike of the press. So it brings with it constraints. What it can fit in the press itself, it's only little. Can't do whole great big sheets that can then later be folded. So it brings with it constraints, but it also brings a great deal of freedom, because I have within those constraints complete control over what I print and what I print it on. So what you can see there is a big pile of books that I have made over the years. I tend to call them all books, whether or not they take a traditional bound book form, just because it's easier. Otherwise, I get into all kinds of trouble. So the idea behind all of this is that the physical form of a book carries with it meaning. I mean, in a simple case, you would know if you pick up an academic work or a piece of science fiction, you know before you've even started what kind of a thing it is you've got in your hand, and you can decide one way or the other how seriously to take those sorts of books. So sort of working outwards from that idea, I try to use format of books to sort of increase the meaning. People call what I do book art. I tend to like to call it printing, but that's fine. A lot of book art, probably most of it, I would say, focuses on the form of the book, but I think of it as a branch of printmaking, really. I tend to really want text to read. That's just me. I like to read things, so I tend to focus on the text first and then think later about how the thing looks. So if we could flick onto the next slide, just a brief word about a book that the book I did before the Mary Butts that was in the exhibition. This is an edition of the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. Great work of Portuguese literature, modernist, early Portuguese modernism. Pessoa didn't publish very much in his lifetime. Most of his collected works were found in a box in his room after he died. And they were, largely speaking, unsorted. So if you buy an edition of Pessoa, most of the time you'll find that it is it's been edited into an order in order to make it into a proper book. So I took a number of the fragments which form the Book of Disquiet, and I printed them on lots of found materials. As you can see, I put them then in a box. Now, part of the point of that was to restore some disorder to the text, so it was no longer edited into an order, so it sort of frees up some meaning. But also, the idea was that this would feel to the reader like it was one of those boxes that I think most of us have in our houses of stuff which hasn't really got a home but is too important to throw away. The idea of that being that actually if you can give people the sense that this thing is important, they can start to build their own meaning from their imagination, and it will enhance and deepen their relationship with the text that they're reading. That's the idea. Whether it works or not is for others to say. The other thing is that the idea is it looks as though it's written across lots and bits and pieces from a life, somebody's life, sort of anchoring the thing into some sort of real life. But the relationship between the individual texts on each of the individual things that you can see and what they're printed on is entirely tangential. I deliberately didn't put, if it was a fragment about a boat, I wouldn't put it on a picture of a boat. I try and introduce a gap in there so that people could fill in their own meaning. So enough about the Book of Disquiet. The book, if we want to move on to the next one of these later, and I'll shoot through these fairly quickly. Imaginary Letters by Mary Butts was the next book that I made after the Book of Disquiet. Mary Butts, early British modernist, sort of active in the teens, 20s and 30s. I've got no evidence of whether she met Charlie Larr, but certainly she knew Harold Edwards, who was Charlie Larr's predecessor at the bookshop. Chances are they knew each other, I would have thought. So this book, the Imaginary Letters was an epistolary novella, 8 letters, published in 1926, originally illustrated by none other than Jean Cocteau, set in Paris. The basis of the story is the narrating character is in love with a fella, and that is not going well. And these letters are each addressed to the narrating character's beloved's mother. But there's no real sense they're real letters that will be sent, because apart from anything else, the mother doesn't speak English and they don't know where she is. So these are letters effectively from the narrating character to herself. So first of all, what you see on the left is how the book presents. First of all, so that's it effectively, I hope, looks like a book, looks like a regular bound book. But when you open it up, as you can see on the right-hand picture there, it's bound with a little ribbon. And then if you want to flick onto the next slide, Layla, sorry, that you can untie the ribbon and then that unpacks into 8 separate letters. When I first read the text, I found I absolutely ripped through the thing. And one of the problems was it took me a couple of goes to slow myself down and to appreciate the difference between each letter, the difference in the texture of what was being said. So although when you open this up, looks hopefully nice and uniform, and it's in nice order 1 to 8. Actually, what happens over each letter is a differentiation. So one more, if you would. So these are pictures of 3 of the individual letters. So the idea between each was I'd try to reflect some of the mood in each letters. So the one on the left is pretty pretty cheerful, like it's the first one in the book, and it's kind of a love letter, and it's all very exciting with the thrill of young love. The one immediately below that is a much more somber, reflective piece, and the biggest picture there you see, that's all just one. It's a numbered set of fragments. So effectively each paragraph has its separate piece. So you have to piece that together, and that's probably the hardest single one to get your head around. So it really, part of the point of this was to slow the reader down, because my experience was I read through it and didn't really get that sense of the differentiation between the letters and the time elapsing. So I'm really trying to force the reader into engaging with the text in a way that actually an ordinary book probably couldn't. And yeah, as I say, it was about emphasizing the differences between the letters, which for me really enriched the experience of reading it. Nearly done. It's worth noting that for this, as far as possible, I started from the text and tried not to think too much about any sort of biographical details outside of the text, with one exception, which was that I sort of semi-accidentally found out that Mary Butts, at the time of writing this book, this novel, was staying at a Hotel Feuille, which is sort of legendary Parisian hangout of writers and artists, including contemporaneously with Joseph Roth, who which is how I found out about it. And I found a letter written by Joseph Roth on some Feuille headed notepaper, and allowed myself the indulgence of having a facsimile made of that headed notepaper, because for the first letter, I quite liked the thought that it's sort of like an establishing shot. It anchored it to a particular place and a particular time. That aside, it was entirely I tried it to make the inspiration for the format of each letter entirely inspired by that letter. I also worked with an illustrator, Lupe Nunez, who gave me lots of really, what I thought were really brilliant candidate illustrations, but all again really fragmentary. So I took those and I placed them inside the text, again with very tangential relationships to what was going on in the text. So hopefully it enhanced and allowed more meaning to be generated by the reader, rather than tying anything down and nailing meaning down. As people read through the text, I have this vague theory that if you can pack in lots of things that look like meaning but leave lots of gaps, then your reader will fill that meaning in, and actually that is quite a powerful thing, because that meaning comes from the reader rather than being included in the book. I happened to be on a talk with Mary Butt's grandson a few years after this came out, and he delighted me by saying he could see why I put in lots of the format points and lots of the visual elements of the book, because he could see how they directly corresponded to his grandmother's life, which that was entirely accidental but extremely pleasing. And I think that's probably all I have to say today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. And I should say to everyone here that we displayed the book, and the part we displayed was that final slide that you showed with all the different paragraphs separated on different types of paper and in different formats, and it generally got a big sort of wow from the people looking at it who hadn't really maybe seen something like that before, and see how you could recreate a book and make you slow down and think of it in a different way. So I think that was very, very important. So we've got about just under 10 minutes left before the end of this session. I just want to thank again the speakers for lots of really great information, but also lots of thinking points. And I wonder if anyone has a question either in the chat or they want to raise their hand and say it out loud. We're going to stop recording, or Tansy probably already has stopped recording, so your questions won't be recorded.